Today on Riffs, Beards, and Gear, we talk about 7 of my favorite rare or obscure guitars. As guitar players, we will inevitably find ourselves lusting after a guitar only to find out that it either hasn't been made in many, many years or was simply never made in great quantities to begin with. But that doesn't mean these guitars still aren't super cool. So I have made a list of 7 of my favorite rare or obscure guitars. Number 1, the Gibson SONEX guitar. Now the Gibson SONEX was kind of meant to compete with the Fender Strat at the time, and it was introduced in 1980 and discontinued in 1984. And there was 3 different trim levels: the deluxe, which was the entry-level guitar, the standard, and then the custom. And the deluxe started at $299 at that time, which was a fair amount of money for 1980. Now the SONEX was most notable because it introduced the Dirty Fingers pickups, which were very, very hot. And it had what Gibson called a multiphonic body, which was basically a block of mahogany, and then they poured resin around it in the shape of a Les Paul. This actually made for a very, very well sustaining guitar, and it was very cheap and inexpensive to make. And these can still be had quite inexpensively. These are not so much rare, but they are pretty obscure, and you can still find them on Reverb for between $600 and $1,000. And a notable user is Jimmy Bower from I Hate God and Down. And a little weird trivia that I still know from the 90s, that the Offspring used a Gibson SONEX into a Mesa Boogie Mark III combo to record all of the guitars for their Smash album. Number 2, the Ovation Ultra GP. Now this is a very, very rare guitar, and it is thought that about 400 were ever made between 1980 and 1986, as Ovation had a very hard time selling the public on their solid body guitars, which their marketing department called hard bodies, and their entire marketing campaign for that time period was centered around that terminology, hard body, and they had scantily clad ladies with the guitar, and it was kind of a mess. Now these originally retailed for about $400, and one of the most notable players to ever play one of these was Josh Homme from Queens of the Stone Age and Kyuss, and he actually owns 2 of them. They came stock with DiMarzio Super 2 pickups and were one of the first guitars to come stock with essentially what were aftermarket pickups, and they are purportedly sounded really good. And they had features like a sculpted heel in the set neck construction, and were generally regarded as very high quality instruments of the time. And if you are even able to find one of these are thousands and thousands of dollars, $3,000 plus, very rare. Number 3, the Robin Machete. Now, Robin is a very small guitar maker out of Texas, Dallas, I believe. And one of the most notable users, Jay from White Zombie, played a couple of different versions of the Machete. I believe there was a standard, and then there was a custom. And it was a very unique body shape. It was kind of an offset, but kind of an 80s shredder, and it was introduced in 1988 and discontinued when the company went under, I believe in the late 90s, early 2000s. Now, I should also note that Robin Guitar's website is still up, but it literally has not been updated in about 20 years. It is a real time capsule. But these guitars are very, very rare, and even brand new, when you would order them from Robin, they would be several $1,000s. So if you are able to find one, and they are out there, expect to pay between $1,000 and $3,000 depending on the options that were ordered at the time of construction. Number 4, the Ibanez Iceman ICJ 100WZ. Now this, speaking of Jay from White Zombie, this was his very short-lived signature model with Ibanez guitars. And this was based on a custom shop Iceman that he had and played in the later years of White Zombie. Now these guitars are very, very rare, and Zach Myers from Shinedown actually posted on Instagram very recently that he was actually able to track one down, and I am very, very jealous of Zach. Now these guitars were made from 1996 to 1999, and less than 300 were ever made. It's approximately 280 or so guitars, and you could really only get these from dealers at the time. They weren't a mass-produced guitar, and from what I can tell, they didn't sell very well. And when they came out, White Zombie then pretty much imploded like a year or two later, and it was just bad timing all around. But if you are able to find one of these ICJ 100WZ Icemans, they will generally go for $4,000 or more. Number 5, the First Act DELGADA. Now, the DELGADA pays an amazing tribute to the Gibson RD shapes of the 70s, which is why I love it as well. But these were predominantly produced in the mid 2000s, when there was a few years where the First Act Custom Shop was giving out guitars and making it rain on post-hardcore bands like it was going out of style. And these DELGADAs were custom ordered initially, and then there was a small production run over a few years and you could get a production model. But the ones that are really, really cool were the custom shop models that were played by Norma Jean, and I think Mastodon had one, and a few others. But these were really, really cool and really, really rare. And they went for, I think at the time, if you were able to order one, if you were a First Act artist, it was well over $3,000 if you spec'd out a basic one. But you could change out the headstock shape and basically any feature you could dream of, the First Act Custom Shop would make you. So every DELGADA that you do come across that I have seen over the years is fairly different from one another. So it's something to be aware of. But if you do want one, expect to pay several $1,000s on up, if you can even find it. Number 6, the Guild S100. Now this is perhaps one of the least rare guitars on this list, but it is still pretty obscure. It was initially made from the late 60s till the late 80s or early 80s. It's kind of unclear when exactly they stopped production on the original run. But the most famous player of this guitar was Kim Thale from Soundgarden. And as a result of Soundgarden's popularity, Guild actually reissued the S100 for just a few years in the mid 90s. Now, the Guild is obviously based kind of on the Gibson SG, but it's a little bit more offset and it's a little wider. And also the tailpiece leaves a bunch of string space between the bridge and the tailpiece, which Kim Thale, most notably, would strum behind and get all sorts of weird, crazy harmonic overtones. And these are very, very cool guitars if you can find them. Now, currently, I believe they are being made by the new owners of Guild, and it's called the S100 Polera. These are not the same guitars, in my opinion. They're a very vintage, vibey S100, and they are not really reminiscent, in my opinion, of the original line of guitars that were predominant in the 1970s. But if you can find an S100 from the 1970s or early 80s, they are actually not that bad priced. They're like $1,500 US, depending on the condition. So definitely, if you want something alternative something other than a Gibson SG, this is definitely a great option. Number 7, the Fender Lead Series. Now the Fender Lead Series was intended to introduce student level players to something similar to a Strat shape without actually having to fork over the cash for a Strat. And the Lead Series came in 3 levels: the Lead 1, the Lead 2, and the Lead 3. And those were different trim options and pickup options, etc., etc. But generally speaking, these were very simple guitars, and they were made from 1979 to 1982. And they ceased production when Fender moved everything over to and started Fender Japan. So then those same students were actually able to get legit Fender Strats for not a lot of money. Now, most notably, a lot of players played these. These were a lot of students' first guitars, including Bono from U2, believe it or not. He actually used to tour with U2 in the early days, and that was the guitar he would play when he would pick up a guitar for a few songs during U2's live set. Pretty cool. Now, these were also known to be played on occasion by Eric Clapton, Steve Morris, and Steve Miller, and just all sorts of players. This was a huge entry point for a lot of people. Not it was entry point for Eric Clapton, because he was obviously doing his own thing by 1979, but you still get the idea. But these can still be had for very little money, for about $600 or $700 in very good condition on the used market. These are pretty cool guitars if you come across one. And that does it for my favorite 7 rare or obscure guitars. If you have a favorite rare or obscure guitar, let me know down in the comments. Maybe we'll make a second video and just talk about the rare stuff, huh? You've been wonderful. I have been Fluff. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.